The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Pearson Speaking About Pedagogy and Practice in English Featured Speakers Series. I'm Steve McKay with the English Marketing Team, and I'm glad you could join us today. I hope that you find the ideas presented by our speaker valuable for your classroom teaching. For those who are new to the webinar format, I have a few quick things to point out before the session begins. If you are calling in by phone, please know that this is not a toll-free number. For that reason, we recommend that you select Use Mic and Speakers in the control bar so that you can listen toll-free through your computer speakers. You may notice that your line has been muted. This is to minimize background noise or any interruptions to the presentation. We do encourage you to ask questions by typing in the text box marked questions on the right-hand side of your screen in the webinar dashboard. If your dashboard seems to have disappeared, hit the yellow arrow and it will open back up. You can send us your questions at any point. When the formal presentation is over, we'll use the remaining time to pose as many of your questions as possible to our speaker. Any questions that we don't get to will be forwarded, along with your email address, to the speaker directly. So all questions will be answered one way or another. Please include your name and school at the beginning of your question. We would also like to invite you to keep up with this conversation on Twitter. To do that, you will follow @PearsonNorthAM and use hashtag PearsonLearn. Okay, so now for a quick introduction. Today's session is titled Arguing Like a Citizen, What's at Stake in Teaching Argument, and is being presented by James S. Miller. James is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. Professor Miller teaches a range of courses on composition, cultural studies, and American literature. He is the author of several composition textbooks and cultural studies readers, among them Acting Out Culture, The Eater Reader, and Perspectives on Argument, co-written with Nancy Wood, now in its 8th edition and published by Pearson. His next textbook is titled Owning Argument and will be published in fall of 2015 and is also happily published by Pearson. Okay, Jim, it's time to turn it over to you. Are you ready to get started?
I am ready.
Great. Let's change presenter here.
Okay. So, Steve, I'm getting a little pop-up that says, I've been made a presenter. Show my screen or not yet? Do I show my screen?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Oh, no, I'm back too. Sorry. There. Are you seeing
Perfect.
My PowerPoint?
Perfect.
Okay, terrific. Wonderful. Well, first of all, let me just say a quick thanks to you, Steve, and to Amy, and to everybody else on the Pearson team for putting this together and making it possible. Obviously, I also want to extend a hello to everybody out there and a thanks to you all as well for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know this is a busy time of the semester. I'm feeling that pinch myself, but I think the chance to connect online, share ideas, and solicit feedback is a valuable one, and for that opportunity, I'm really grateful. So I feel like I should almost come clean here at the beginning and say, starting out, that I begin today's talk with just a little bit of self-consciousness. I wish I could say that the topic for today's discussion, the relationship between argumentation and citizenship, sprang forth intact and fully formed in a sudden burst of insight and inspiration. But I have to confess that this topic has actually taken several years to really come into focus, taking shape only gradually as I've worked to figure out exactly where notions of citizenship fit within my vision of what the writing classroom should be. Like so many of us who teach writing, I've long accepted that these notions belong somewhere. And for just as long, I've been convinced that the concept of citizenship has a particularly valuable role to play in the teaching of argument. More than any other type of writing, it is argument, in my view, that most directly and fruitfully invites considerations about what it means to think and act like a citizen. And I should say at this point that I use that particular formulation, think and act like a citizen, intentionally. It is crucial, I think, to acknowledge that citizenship encompasses both of these dimensions. that citizenship is not just a way of acting, but a way of thinking as well. To play the role of citizen is not simply to engage in the kinds of practices often gathered under the heading performing our civic duty. It is also to reflect critically on why we engage in such practices in the first place. Broadly conceived, citizenship asks us to consider some pretty fundamental questions. What are my core values? How do I want to live out these values in my daily life? How do these values compare to those held by others? And what do I do when these differing values come into conflict? It is no coincidence that argument asks us to answer many of the same questions. Like being a good citizen, being an effective arguer involves bridging the divide between action and reflection. It requires not only that we understand what we want to say and how we want to say it, but also why it is worth saying in the first place. What makes our ideas or views meaningful? How do we assess the validity, or their validity rather, in comparison to those of others? What are the implications of acting on them in the wider world around us? Indeed, what links argument and citizenship together most formatively is their shared belief that the views and values we hold are consequential, that they are most meaningful when they are put into practice. Given these many congruencies, you might think that putting together a pedagogy that integrates the tenets of argumentation with the practices of citizenship would be easy. It isn't. At least it has not proven so for me. One reason for this, I think, has to do with the fact that citizenship itself has in recent years become an especially contentious and partisan term within the debates over education in the wider culture. To illustrate, let's consider one recent controversy, this one involving a decision by the Texas State Board of Education to push through a controversial set of revisions to their statewide high school social studies curriculum. First, a bit of background. In 2013, a block of conservative members to the Texas State Board of Education voted to mandate that the textbook used to teach American history in high schools across the state be revised to, quote, preserve and promote the true ideals of American citizenship. Among the revisions the board advocated were changes to more explicitly promote the idea of America as a Christian nation, give greater prominence to the achievements and contributions of conservative political figures, endorse the idea of American exceptionalism, and downplay any references to or discussion of examples of social conflict or political protest. It isn't hard to discern the model of citizenship that underlies this call for curricular change. Stated succinctly, it is one that equates being a true citizen with espousing a reflexive nationalism and endorsing narratives of American rightness. Less immediately apparent, but equally significant, is the vision of learning this model of citizenship calls for at the same time. Absent here is any suggestion that true citizenship involves learning that might include critical reflection, active inquiry, or open-minded civic engagement. According to the Texas State Board of Education, true citizens study history in order to have predetermined, culturally dominant assumptions about American greatness confirmed, not to explore or interrogate what such assumptions mean, or what the consequences of accepting them might be. Leveraging the classroom to serve more narrow, partisan ends, this example demonstrates how easily in our current political climate, the language of citizenship can be co-opted to serve purposes ultimately antithetical to its own promise. And, lest we think this sort of thing happens only in red state battles over U.S. history instruction, it should be noted that this same cultural logic can be found within countless other public debates about the current state of American education. On the national level, in fact, it has become fashionable to speak of education reform as essentially a vocationally driven enterprise, the purpose of which is to train the next generation of job seekers to compete and succeed in the 21st century. A view critic Jonathan Kozol has aptly termed preparing minds for markets. Like the patriotic edicts issued by the Texas School Board, this vocational discourse of education reform makes its case by promoting a vision that defines learning itself as a kind of instrumental undertaking, one that involves mastering a discrete body of information or skills in order to achieve particular and predetermined outcomes. To illustrate, let's look at a couple of representative examples, both of which involve recent pronouncements from the Obama administration. The first is an excerpt from a 2014 speech by President Obama himself. Now is the time to build a firmer, stronger foundation for growth that will not only withstand future economic storms, but one that helps us strive and compete in the global economy. It's time to reform our colleges so that they provide Americans a chance to learn the skills and knowledge necessary to compete for the jobs of the future. The second example comes from a screen grab from the White House homepage about education. And I would just point out here the way that this web page sort of constellates the same key set of terms: education, knowledge, skills, jobs, etc. Once again, it isn't hard to discern the model of citizenship being sketched out here. Good citizens strive to succeed in the global economy. They engage in healthy, robust competition for the jobs of the future. And once again, we see how this citizenship model is underwritten by a very particular conception of what real learning involves, figured within these two examples as the acquisition and application of useful skills and knowledge. As with the Texas example, missing here is any suggestion that the 21st century classroom might serve as a different kind of arena, one that fosters critical inquiry, self-reflection, or open-ended dialogue, an environment in which students don't simply train to become productive workers, but strive to become active, engaged, and thoughtful citizens. So this is the cultural context in which my thoughts about argumentation and citizenship have been taking shape. But there is a second context that has influenced my thinking on this subject just as strongly: the context of my own classroom. Somewhat dispiritingly, I have found that many of my own students remain in thrall to precisely the kind of vocational paradigm outlined above. For them, it is simply a given that the point of going to school is to get a good job, and that the most important work is that which supplies them with the marketable skills needed to make this happen. Not surprisingly, for many of these students, this vocationalized vision of learning finds its echo in the way they approach the more particular work of studying argument. Put simply, they treat this work as a job, a mechanical exercise in which the objective is to plug in a rote set of skills to achieve a predetermined outcome. By way of example, imagine the driest, least inspired attempt to teach the Toolman model of analysis, and you'll have some idea of how my efforts to get these students to engage argument has tended to go. Step 1, identify the claim. Step 2, describe the support. Step 3, uncover the warrant. 1, 2, 3, plug in the formula, follow the steps. Without dismissing the importance of vocational considerations altogether, or the utility of step-by-step approaches to writing analysis, I do want to suggest that we do our students a disservice when we too easily permit this kind of instrumental educational paradigm to reign entirely unchecked. One of the surest ways to forestall this possibility, I believe, is to create a pedagogy that places questions about the relationship between argument and citizenship at its very center. In practical terms, this means starting with a framework that helps students see the fundamental and critical ways argument and citizenship are connected. Argument, on the one hand, can be understood as a vehicle for reflecting on citizenship. What does it mean to act like a citizen? How can argument serve as a means to just that kind of reflection? And how can this kind of reflection through argument serve as a prelude to taking action? Argument, on the other hand, can also serve as a vehicle for enacting citizenship. Central to this idea is the belief that argument is its own form of action, a vehicle for making tangible difference in the world. Again, back to this idea of argument, like citizenship, as being deeply consequential. Of course, I'm hardly the first person to weigh in on this question. Scholars have long searched for ways to foster and facilitate active and engaged citizenship within the classroom. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the way this extensive body of scholarship has influenced my own thinking on this topic. And this next screen I mean more as a kind of homage to our touchstone figure, John Dewey, and his work, Democracy in Education. But I have another critic I want to reference as well in the following screen. Among the more recent generation of scholars who have explored what it means to teach citizenship, I have taken my cue from Richard Oman, a cultural studies scholar who has also written extensively about the role writing instruction can play in fostering engaged and meaningful civic action. Like Oman, I've wanted to inquire more deeply into what he describes as the supposition that higher education and schooling in general serve a democratic society by nourishing hearty citizenship. As Oman rightly notes, democracy can't work unless citizens are literate and informed. But Oman also reminds us that this goal is much easier to assert than it is to achieve. What a good college education can and does achieve in the arena of citizenship, he writes, is help students to refine and develop their literacy into a vehicle of self-advancement. But this project is destined to fall short of its intended goal if we fail to account for what Oman calls the structural inequities that define the actual lives of students out there in the real world. When deployed within an academic context, the term citizen often carries a presumption of universal or abstract equality, a presumption frequently belied by the actual barriers students confront in their everyday lives. There is no way for composition, nor for education in general, writes Oman, to escape this basic fact. So what exactly are we to do? Well, one thing to do, I think, is to return to the concept of citizenship and redefine it in a way that better reflects the realities of students' daily lived experience. Part of the problem, it seems to me, is that we are heirs to a scholarly legacy that defines citizenship in such formal or abstract ways that the concept ceases to feel meaningful or accessible to the very students we aim to reach. What we need instead is an approach that treats citizenship as something students experience and enact within the dynamics of their own daily lives. An approach that helps students develop a sense that their daily actions and choices are consequential, a sense that they themselves are actors and agents. The class in which I have tried most consistently to implement this approach is English 101, a freshman introductory composition class all first-year students on my campus are required to take. While many within the college's administration continue to view English 101 as a service course in which students are taught the rules and mechanics of so-called correct writing, many instructors in my department have long sought to expand this course beyond the boundaries of this narrow mandate. Like so many instructors across the country, many in my department have worked to turn English 101 into a class that uses the framework of argument instruction to introduce students to some of the essentials of critical thinking. I, not surprisingly, am no exception. My own efforts in this regard have involved trying to elicit from my students a greater sense of identification and ownership over the material at hand. And toward this end, I have chosen over the last several semesters to organize my English 101 course around the concept of social status, a theme that is not only personally relatable to my students, but that also, I hope, offers them a lens through which they can examine and reflect upon their own agency. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why the title of the course is so small. I don't mean to de-emphasize it. It's more my own technical limitations, so my apologies for that. That should be in the same font or size. As the syllabus here suggests, I try to accomplish this goal by asking students to consider a number of key questions. Among them, how does our culture define success? What are the standards by which our self-worth is measured? And how much control do we have over what these definitions and standards look like? One of the assignments I have used to anchor this approach involves the close reading of an excerpt from Barbara Ehrenreich's best-selling journalistic account of minimum wage work, Nickel and Dimed. Many of you, no doubt, know this book quite well, and may even have taught parts or all of it in a course of your own. But for those who might not be as familiar with this text, here's a quick overview. Nickel and Dime tells the story of Ehrenreich's efforts during the late 1990s to live for a full year working only minimum wage jobs. As a very pointed kind of social experiment, the book not only offers a sobering portrait of the struggles, challenges, and injustices that define the world of the working poor, it also presents a critique of the broader systems that trap minimum wage workers in circumstances and cycles that deny them even their most basic agency. It is a very well-known book, widely anthologized over the years, and, for my purposes, very well suited to my goal of engendering critical conversations about civic engagement, civic responsibility, and the role that argument can play in fostering both. Each semester, I have asked my English 101 students to read Nickel and Dimed, and we have concluded by taking a closer look at one of the passages in the final section of the book, entitled Evaluation, where the author takes stock of her years spent living on the socioeconomic margins and shares her thoughts about what she believes her readers should take away from her account. I need to read this in its entirety because I really love it. Guilt, you may be thinking warily. Isn't that what we're supposed to feel? But guilt doesn't go anywhere near far enough. The appropriate emotion is shame. Shame at our own dependency, in this case on the underpaid labor of others. When someone works for less pay than she can live on, when, for example, she goes hungry so that you can eat more cheaply and conveniently, then she has made a great sacrifice for you. She has made you a gift of some part of her abilities, her health, and her life. The working poor, as they are approvingly termed, are in fact the major philanthropists of our society. They neglect their own children so that the children of others will be cared for. They live in substandard housing so that the other homes will be shiny and perfect. They endure privation so that inflation will be low and stock prices high. To be a member of the working poor is to be an anonymous donor, a nameless benefactor to everyone else. There are a lot of things I love about this passage. I love that it throws my students into the middle of an urgent and topical issue, that it calls out our personal involvement and responsibility, that it invites us to see a political or social or economic issue as a personal one as well, and that in so doing it collapses the distance between what we might call the notional and the experiential. the difference between what we think, read, or talk about on the one hand, and what we actually do or should do on the other. I also love the fact that it does all these things by making an elegant argument of its own, having to do with the distinction between guilt and shame, the dependency of the comfortable on the labor of the working poor, the inverse relationship between those whose needs are served and those whose needs are sacrificed, and the shame with which we should regard this entire situation. Rhetorically, what I appreciate above all else is the implied you that stands at the heart of this passage. A you that serves as the linchpin for exactly the kind of engaged, reflective, activist reading I hope to elicit from my students. One that builds a bridge between reflection and action, that joins thinking and doing, and that, to my mind, models what it really means to argue like a citizen. Here's what I've typically asked my students to do in response to the passage we just read. I've asked them to explore the specific reasons Ehrenreich cites for why we should feel shameful. I have asked them to cite specific reasons or evidence she offers to support this argument. I have asked them to assess the extent to which they feel implicated in or responsible for the situation she describes. And finally, I have asked them to discuss what they think they should do next. And while there have been some exceptions, here is what I have typically seen in my own students' responses to those prompts. I have found that my students are pretty proficient in identifying the basics of Ehrenreich's argument. But I also regularly encounter an unwillingness among them to take the next step. That is to say, to seriously, or to take seriously rather, the proposition that they should regard this issue as their problem. And the two responses I have up on the screen now are emblematic in many ways of precisely that wall that I feel like my students hit. So the question is, what are we to make, or what am I to make since they're my students, of such responses? More specifically, how do we square these students' obvious ability to recognize and analyze Ehrenreich's formal argument with their equally evident reluctance to take up the challenge she presents as this argument's centerpiece? What is it that prevents them from seeing themselves as legitimate stakeholders in this discussion? And how does one go about helping them more directly engage this argument as citizens? In the time I have remaining, I'd like to share a few thoughts about one very preliminary plan I've come up with for addressing just these kinds of questions. More specifically, I'd like to walk through some of the strategies I've developed that are intended to help my students cultivate a deeper, more reflective, and I hope ultimately more activist engagement with the argument that Ehrenreich is making. I should say up front that this is a challenge I've taken up thus far only hypothetically. While I've been getting these kinds of responses from my students for years, it is only in the last month or so, spurred in fact by the prospect of giving this talk, that I've actually begun to assemble a set of strategies for addressing the questions about argument and citizenship these responses raise. Which is another way of saying that this discussion, or the discussion that follows, is definitely a work in progress. It is definitely my hope that this discussion will offer some guidance to those of you confronting a similar challenge in your own classroom. But I also have to admit that this is more of a framework and very much one that poses questions rather than presents answers. And in that sense, I'm hoping that the discussion to follow might prompt some critical conversation among all of us about how it might be built upon and improved. So to set the stage, as I meditated on the split character of my students' responses to Ehrenreich, it occurred to me that they might feel a greater sense of identification and ownership if I were to put one of the issues her book raises into a broader set of contexts. And so I began thinking about ways to place the issue of the minimum wage, the issue that perhaps more than any other lies at the center of Nickel and Dimed, into three distinct but related contexts: historical, civic, and personal. A quick word here, though, about context. Contextualizing is no panacea. Every question about a given issue isn't automatically answered by, quote, putting it into context. It's important, I think, to guard against the assumption that contexts automatically speak for themselves, that once an issue is put into its proper context, students will immediately and intuitively understand how and why it matters. What we need instead is an approach that treats context as more than simply a fixed or static background, that allows us to actively engage with context, to enter into a kind of dialogue with it in order to see how it can help us identify how different settings and different stakes can give shape to different arguments about the very same issue. What context can do, in other words, is create the conditions under which we can begin to think about argument in terms of citizenship. Contextualizing an issue not only helps us better identify the broader factors that frame it, whether these be social, political, cultural, historical, etc., it also shines a light on the way these factors influence the particular kinds of interest or investment people feel in it. Rather than definitively answer the question, why does an issue matter, context helps us understand why different people answer that question so differently. And so, as regards nickel and dime, my first step was to place the issue of the minimum wage into a historical context. How and where, I want my students to consider, did debates over the minimum wage originate? Who were these original stakeholders, and what were their competing interests? To address these questions, I chose the example of a 1933 speech by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in support of the National Recovery Act. A little background. This speech was given about 3 years into the Great Depression, a time of massive unemployment and rampant homelessness, public panic as well. FDR had recently been elected and was busily putting together a wave of New Deal legislation designed to stem this panic and to stabilize the economic situation. And the National Recovery Act was one such effort to accomplish this goal. Foremost among its features, and the one FDR most directly addresses in the excerpt I've included here, is its call for the establishment of a national living wage for workers across a range of industries. I don't want to walk through every detail of this excerpt, but I do want to call out what I think is one of its more noteworthy aspects, and that is really how sort of vividly it illustrates the importance of stakes and stakeholders to understanding arguments. You know, and to my mind, what's most striking about this speech is the fact that its argument unfolds more or less as a kind of recitation of who the different stakeholders are. It's as if Roosevelt is saying to his audience, you can't really understand the larger point I'm trying to make unless you also understand the stake that different constituencies have in addressing it. In order to build on this insight, my next step is to place FDR's speech into a somewhat broader, more inclusive historical context, one that depicts a range of different stakeholders in a variety of different settings presenting their views on this same issue. So, for example, in this first visual, we have a protest, a social demonstration, and there are a certain set of questions that we can pose to get at how stakes and stakeholders help us, or at least provide the kind of framework or context for understanding the argument. What is significant about the fact that this is a public protest? It presents a collection of, or a gathering of, displaced but also racially diverse workers. What kind of stake might this population or this particular constituency have in the issue of a living wage? And how does this setting compare, for example, to this? A different context for addressing largely the same issue. How is this setting different than the one presented earlier? How is this different setting related to what appears to be a very different view being espoused? What does this setting, what does this message say about the stakeholder here who has presented this argument? Likewise for visual number 3. With an historical framework established, or at least sketched out, the next step, it seems to me, is to situate this same issue in a more contemporary context, to look at an example of how this debate is playing out publicly today. How, I want my students to consider, do discussions and debates about a living wage continue to live on today? How do the stakeholders in this current discussion compare with the stakeholders from an earlier era? How do historical differences produce, how do these historical differences produce different arguments? The examples I chose for this context include visuals of the recent strike by fast food workers, very much in support of the same idea of a living wage. So we have social protests presented in a much more kind of contemporary setting. We have not only one set of stakeholders referenced here, but a number. In fact, I'm going to go back for just a minute. One question, an historical question to pose here, would be how these public demonstrations compare to the images of demonstrations presented in the Depression era visuals. What is similar? What is different? What has changed? What has not? Another has to do with the way these particular visuals here depict and implicitly comment upon who the stakeholders actually are. Respect our right to unite, no retaliation. How do we summarize that as a kind of view or argument in and of itself? What kind of stakeholders do these protesters holding the signs seem to be? But what is also significant about the fact that this visual includes the McDonald's logo, or following this, the police in the third visual? What difference does it make that these other, at least potential stakeholders, are also included? Does it make sense to think of a cop or a representative of the fast food industry as a comparable stakeholder to the workers or the protesters themselves? These are not questions that I pretend to have answers to, nor am I really confident at this point that they are exactly the right questions to prompt my students, or maybe students in general, to begin really thinking and arguing like citizens. But I think that they point in the right direction. I think that they point, in fact, to what I would like to conclude this quick discussion with. Oh, sorry, this is a set of excerpts from a Twitter feed about the fast food living wage protests. I think these questions that I've posed point to where ultimately I would like this kind of approach to go, which is a third and final step involving getting students to place this same issue into the context of their own lives, to create a framework that helps them recognize themselves as legitimate stakeholders in an argument over the living wage. Now, the outline I've presented here, again, is meant much more to sketch out ideas than to sort of offer a definitive sort of lesson plan. But I do think that it's significant to note that the destination, the goal here of this approach is to arrive at a point where students see their own lives as context, as critical context in which their points of view and their particular stake or interest in an issue is actively being shaped. It seems to me that that recognition is key and a kind of essential prelude to any form of meaningful active agency to follow. So, as I said a moment ago, what I have presented in these last few minutes truly is just an outline. But in a sense, I think there's something maybe a little bit appropriate about concluding my talk today by presenting a framework that is more skeletal than complete, more speculative than definitive. As I hope I've made clear throughout this talk, the effort to join citizenship to arguments, to cultivate a sense of ownership and investment, agency and action, is an endeavor that in many ways is better left at least a bit open-ended. After all, if the challenge before us is to push back against a politics of education that instrumentalizes learning, that encourages us to aspire to a predetermined path or settle for the one-size-fits-all answer, perhaps there is virtue in a stance that makes it clear that there is far more work to be done. And so it is in that spirit that, Steve, I hand things back over to you and very much invite whoever might have questions to please pose them. And thank you once again for allowing me to take up your time and share my thoughts.
Well, thank you on behalf of all of the attendees. Really amazing presentation, lots to think about. We do have a few minutes that we can open up the question and answer portion of our webinar. Once again, if you wanted to pose a question or even had a comment, please go ahead and type that in the question box in your dashboard there and send it to us, and I will shout out to Professor Miller and see if he can give us some guidance. While we're waiting for people to kind of weigh in, I just wanted to comment on how impressed I was that you were using one of my favorite books that I read in college was Nickel and Dimed. And,
good.
I just kind of assumed that you get a lot of, well, I guess you addressed that question, that there's varied reactions from students, pro and con, and are there specific assignments that they're working on in relation to that book? How do you solicit those kind of responses from them?
Yeah, a lot of the work that we do with that book is, it sort of takes the form of shorter, kind of more pointed writing prompts, writing assignments that they're not exactly sort of free thought pieces, but I really do, want to. I mean, I find it so fascinating that their reaction to this book and the project that Aaron Reich is undertaking, that their reaction is so mixed that I really want to, I want to sort of sample the flavor of that kind of affective response. So a lot of the work is, it's close reading and sort of response and reflect on a passage, the way I sort of modeled it in this presentation today. Some of the assignments that are a little bit more sort of formally organized, ask students to kind of imagine themselves in the same position. They're putting themselves in the position of a writer or who is interested in sort of doing the same kind of work, or which is really the true aim of this book, I think, putting themselves in the role of, or imagining themselves in the role of one of the workers that Aaron Reich profiles. So I think, and on the topic of just more broadly of what's really at issue or at the root of their, kind of mixed responses to this book, I've gone back and forth. I mean, I think that, as I said before, I do think that some of that resistance to the kind of activist reading that I think Aaron Reich really wants is sort of due to the legacy of schooling, which works so much in kind of counter direction, sort of constructing their role in much more passive and distancing kind of terms. It's strange for them to think that a book is actually soliciting their or inviting them to take some kind of concrete action. I think some of it for my students too is the fact that many of them, some of them at least, are not all that far from the precincts of the working poor. Many of my students are the first in their family to have gone to college, and I think that as they see, I think the intention behind Aaron Reich's project, but they can't let go of their awareness of her privilege, which she fully calls out in the book. She calls herself out as a member of the comfortable class. but there's something I think that rubs some of my students a little bit wrong just in the very idea of this undertaking, that there's something, well, that it's temporary, and that she does have the out at the end to return to her privileged life, raises questions of motive and raises questions of credibility for a number of my students. And I think that, frankly, another context for this is just plain cultural, that that these models and these notions of success are very hard to let go of, especially when a lot of students, we all to a certain extent, kind of use these notions of success to set our path, and to give our sense of the work we're engaged in, to give it a sense of purpose and coherence. If we stop believing in the idea that you work hard and you therefore succeed, if we're shown through a book examples of fellow citizens for whom that just doesn't happen, that's a real shock. It's a useful one, I think, but I think it's a difficult one. So that was a much more long-winded response than you probably wanted.
No, it's such a provocative book and such a provocative topic, and I feel like on one hand I praise the author for shining a light on the situation of the working poor in the United States, but also it shines a light on the reader and forces them to kind of come to some conclusions, and you're obviously helping to facilitate that. So
I hope. I mean, that's something that Ehrenreich says, that the topic of the book is not just poverty, it's also privilege, right? Mm-hmm. Privilege is a subject that gets very deeply interrogated in this book.
Really fascinating stuff. We don't have any questions on hand, and we are reaching the limits of our hour here. So I did want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. We do have 2 more webinars. We have them every Thursday at 3 o'clock, and you're more than welcome to sign up for the last 2 that we have on tap are with Cheryl Nixon, talking about some literature topics, and we have Donna Makusek from the Community College of Baltimore County, and she's talking about some developmental English topics. So this topic that we just covered today has been recorded, and we will offer the link to you so that if you missed any part of it, that you could go to our Pedagogy and Practice website and view the video. You'll be getting that link in an email probably in a day or 2. So once again, thank you to Professor Miller for your wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. And hope to
Thanks very much, everybody.
Hear from you guys all soon. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
Bye now.